So I've tried to make this video about 3 separate times now, and it just keeps on not going well. Either my microphone quality is really terrible or my camera goes out of focus for half the video. So anyway, for anyone who hasn't watched one of my videos before, I'm Ember. I got married the very beginning of June, and I was intending to record and post this video in like last November. It's February now, so it's been a while. As you can probably tell from my dress right here, you can only see the bottom half of it, but it's not your typical wedding dress. The reason I decided to make my own wedding dress was, one, I wanted to do something not traditional. I really like the look of a white wedding dress. I think that it's very beautiful, but for a wedding, it just kind of doesn't sit super well with me. I wanted my dress and the decorations and just kind of everything to really show my personality and make it really customized to who we are as people, and so going for an all-white dress just kind of felt like it was limiting my creativity. So I went through a few different ideas. I went through a lot of Pinterest posts and on Instagram and people's blogs, and just kind of looked through a lot of things for a while. I was considering having a more pastel dress with flowers on it. I considered having a black or a mixture of white and black in my wedding dress, and nothing was really feeling like it hit me right. And for a long time I was thinking that I was gonna go and buy a pre-made wedding dress. So I was thinking of, looking on Etsy for wedding dresses. I was looking at prom stores for prom dresses that would still look wedding-esque, because I did want it to look like a wedding dress. I didn't want it to look like it was, a prom dress or anything else. So I was trying to find something that looked like a wedding dress but also wasn't just white, which can be a kind of hard thing to do. So that's why I kind of was looking for more pastels with the flowers and kind of ball gown shaped dresses. But yeah, nothing really sat really well with me. I definitely loved all the dresses I was looking at, but it didn't really feel like it was my wedding dress. I think anyone else who has gotten married or is going to be married can kind of relate to that a little bit. Another reason I decided to make my own dress is that we were on a very, very tight budget. We wanted to put most of our money towards our honeymoon to Iceland, which I will also be making a video about that. Iceland is honestly one of the most expensive places you can vacation to, and we do not have a lot of money. So between me wanting to go for an untraditional type of dress and having a hard time finding one that sat well with me, and me also wanting to keep under a budget, I ended up deciding to make my own. I did have some knowledge of sewing, so I kind of knew how to basically work a sewing machine. I have always been really good at kind of picking up creative hobbies like that, and so since I already had a start on it, I figured that it was at least possible to make something that would suffice. And honestly, I'm surprised at how close this dress got to my vision that I originally had. So as I was deciding that I was going to make my own wedding dress, I was looking at a few pictures that were kind of as close to what I wanted my dress to be, because since I wasn't looking to buy one anymore, I could look at more unique kinds of dresses that weren't for sale and kind of try to replicate that a little bit. So for the reason I went for a fiery look, as I said before, my nickname is Ember. Part of the reason why I chose that nickname was because during my teenage years, I went through really, really rough times. Shortly after I met my husband, I kind of started getting that fire back in me that I had before I started struggling. And so it kind of felt like I was like a burning ember. As I started growing once I met my husband, it felt like I was kind of bursting back into flames. And so because of that whole idea that I have in my head, and because of the nickname, I kind of thought that it was perfect to make my dress look like it was bursting into flames. So that's what I tried to go for with this. I think it might have ended up looking more sunsetty than I was intending to. The bottom here, I was hoping to have more of a like core of the flame bright blue. and the dye just didn't really work the way I was hoping for it to. But I hope that it still looks pretty fiery. Once I kind of figured that out, I started looking for fabric. I knew I wanted it to be tulle because tulle flows really well, and since I was going for kind of a fiery look, that's definitely something that was a priority to me in my dress. I ended up having to wait for like 3 months to get it at a good sale, and so I bought the 30 yards of tulle, and it barely covered this whole thing. And while I was working on getting that fabric, I was working on a structured bodice or corset that I was planning to wear under the dress. I kind of was trying to avoid putting boning into the actual dress because I figured it would be kind of hard to get on and off and hard to wear and easier to mess up. And because the tulle is so expensive, I really didn't want to risk ruining it by putting in boning and then realizing that I did it wrong. First, I made one out of a bit of fabric from a bed underskirt to test my pattern, and when that went well, I made the actual corset. And as you can see from the picture, the boning stuck out a little bit in areas where I didn't. I've never made a corset or anything like it before. I did pretty minimal research on it, so it kind of makes sense that this part didn't really go according to plan, and I ended up not using it at all. Once I started actually working on the dress itself, and I tried to put the corset on under it, it just kind of ended up being too bulky and too uncomfortable. So all of that was kind of for nothing, but that was one step in the process. So I ended up drafting my own pattern. The first time I tried to draft it using this method I found on YouTube where you wrap duct tape around yourself and then you draw on the pattern pieces and then you cut it all out and make the pattern out of that. And so that was my first attempt. I still don't know what I did wrong with that, but something definitely went very wrong. Also, I used interfacing to try to make it more stiff, and the interfacing was crumbling and disintegrating, so I don't know what was up with that either, but the whole thing, every part of it just was really terrible. An alternative way of making it that actually worked really well, where I just drew a picture of what I wanted the bodice to be and where I wanted the seams to be, and then I kind of put marks with washable marker on my body and measured between those dots to have them match up to the picture I drew, and kind of just measured all of those lengths I needed, and then, you know, did some math, drew it all out on some paper, and using that as a pattern, and that worked much better. I did still have to do a couple of adjustments to make it fit well, but overall it was way better. And then I also used some curtains that I got from the thrift store to replace the interfacing, which worked actually way better than the interfacing, and it was way less expensive as well. I couldn't find any white curtains that were that thick, so I ended up using blue curtains, and luckily it didn't end up showing through in the end. I knew that after I got the tulle on, the chances were low that you'd be able to see it through, and I was right, you couldn't see it through by the time I put the tulle on, so nobody would even know that I had a piece of a thrifted curtain in the inside of my dress. Like, no one would know, so I thought that was kind of cool. Something else that I forgot to mention is that I also wanted it to be a lace-up back, because at the time I was in the process of losing weight, and honestly till this point I still am. I couldn't guarantee that I would be the same weight during the wedding as I was when I was sewing the dress, and it took a lot of experimenting to get it to lay flat. Even still, it buckled more than it should have. I don't really know much about boning and getting it to fit your body well, but a lot of the time it ended up just making lumps where there weren't any lumps and not really forming to my body well. It would have been really simple if I was just having it go to my waist, but because I was having it go to like the center of my hips, it had to like kind of have that curve in at the waist and then out again at the hips. In hindsight, that was a really bad idea to put that much pressure on me to get that complicated of a thing right, especially since I was on a budget and I couldn't really afford, like, you know, steel boning or tools to, you know, form it really well. I just used cheap plastic boning. I used an iron to try to curve it right, and it just was a bad idea. I shouldn't have expected that much out of myself when I didn't have the proper knowledge or tools to take on something so extreme. And then after that, I made a duct tape mannequin. I think I used the same duct tape that I used for my pattern. At first, it was kind of accurate, but eventually it ended up getting kind of squished and misshapen, so I wouldn't really recommend doing that the way I did it, but it worked well enough for what I needed it for, I guess. So I used that makeshift dress form to drape on the tulle for the bodice. I wanted it to be folded and layered, so I used that to kind of layer the tulle on top of the bodice to try to get it to fit well. I used it to pin the layers of the dress on. I actually had 2 different kinds of fabric. So for some reason at this point I didn't know the whole sewing technique of setting your sewing machine to a long stitch and just stitching down your piece of fabric that way and gathering it by holding one of those strings and just pulling all the fabric down. I didn't know about that for some reason, so I ended up taking every piece of tulle and hand gathering it. So I'd use a needle and thread and just go back and forth with the needle across the whole piece of tulle by hand and then gather it that way. And it took like probably 2 weeks of doing that by hand to actually get through all of it. I'm pretty sure I watched all of Yona Yinton's videos doing that and thought, oh, I'll just, get through a couple videos while I do this. I watched like all the way up to the current present moment with her videos. That is how long it took me to get through all of this. But eventually I got all of it gathered and I got it all pinned onto the dress form, and I cut all of it to the perfect length because I had the dress form set to my exact height and I wanted it to just barely touch the floor. I actually decided that I wanted the train to be removable because I wanted to be able to enjoy the rest of the wedding and the party without having a train getting caught on things, which I loved in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it was also a huge pain. I ended up making the train be able to button on and off, so the actual train itself had little buttonholes on the inside of the little band at the top, and then the dress itself had buttons sewn onto it, and it was really hard and time consuming to get those buttoned on and off. I'm sure there was an easier way to have done that, but that's not to this point yet. That was later on. So the next step before I started actually sewing the pieces together and sewing them onto the dress was dyeing them. So I actually used a method for this that I never saw anybody use. I looked for like weeks to try to figure out how to do this, and for some reason I couldn't find a single person that had dyed more than 2 colors on their fabric. Basically, I found people who had dip dyed just the bottom. I'd seen people do kind of dyeing the top of it one color and the bottom of the other color, so they, dip the top in and then let it dry and then dip the bottom in. There was one person that used a spray paint on it, and I wanted my dress to be able to get wet and be washed with soap and still have it stick. And so I figured that if I spray painted it, that would be a little bit risky in that department, and I didn't want to try to do that. I ended up actually taking like the strip of tulle that hadn't been sewn together yet and folding it and then dipping that fold into the dye. I was using RIT dye, and there's 2 different ways you can use it. You can put it in a tub of warm water and leave it for a longer time to dye it, and it might not be as vibrant, or you can do it on the stovetop in like simmering water. So I kind of went back and forth between the 2 because if I had to leave them in longer, then I wanted to do more at once, so I didn't have to hold each one of them by hand and let it soak for 30 minutes. And when I tried to speed it up by putting multiple in at once, sometimes they would end up tipping over, and part of the fabric that wasn't supposed to be dyed, that was supposed to stay white or that was supposed to be dyed another color, would fall into the dye bath because I wasn't holding all of them at once. But then when I tried to do the stovetop method, I had to be hyper aware of how long I was holding it in, because since it worked a lot more quickly and I wanted all of the pieces to be kind of the same level of vibrancy, I would have to wear gloves so that the dye that was evaporating into the air wouldn't soak into my skin, and so that my hands wouldn't get burned. Sometimes I would get dye on the gloves and then grab the fabric, and then that dye would get on the fabric. Long story short, both ways were very problematic with the lack of tools that I had to do this, and because of the fact that I'd never seen anybody do this before. And so dye ended up getting transmitted to parts that I didn't want it on multiple times, and the worst point was when I was dyeing it red. Because of where the fold had to be for the red, and because of the elastics that I used to try to hold all the fabric together, because basically what I did was I folded it in half, and then all of the excess fabric I put a plastic bag over and tied it over with a hair tie or a rubber band to keep it from unraveling, and to keep it so that if there was any dye that splashed onto it, it would just get the plastic bag. But What I didn't realize was with the red, since it was kind of in the center of the fabric, there wasn't a lot of fabric to be hanging off the edge of the dye bath. And also the elastic and the plastic had to be closer to the part that was being dyed. What ended up happening was, because of the tension, I guess, where the elastic was, it allowed for the dye that was at the bottom to travel up through the fabric because of the elastic holding it together into the plastic covered part, to the point where all of the white that was supposed to be at the top was now pink or red. And I cried for so long about this. I thought I completely ruined my whole wedding dress. In the end, it ended up turning out okay. I figured out that there is a RIT color remover, and so I used that on the fabric. It unfortunately didn't get all of it out, but it got most of it out, and I also didn't have too much of a problem with it at that point, because with fire there are normally little wisps of flame above the actual fire itself. And after I had removed most of the dye with the RIT color remover, it ended up looking kind of like that little bit of flame. So in the end, it wasn't a big deal, and it didn't ruin the dress. It actually added something to it, depending on how you look at it. And because I was so exhausted by the time that I got to the blue at the bottom, I decided I wanted to do the dye bath instead of the stovetop method. And for whatever reason, this color of blue didn't really like that method, and it barely changed the color. I wanted it to be that like vibrant ocean blue almost that you see at the core of a flame, and it didn't end up being that way, and I ended up using all of the dye in the dye bath trying to get it to look that way. And by the end of it, I just decided that it wasn't worth it to me to buy new dye and go through the whole stovetop method after going through the dye bath method. And something else I had to do was, when I first dyed the red part, it ended up looking more of a burgundy color, so I ended up having to go back over the red with some yellow and some orange mixed together to kind of brighten up the color. And that actually worked out perfectly. So after I had gone back over the red, all of the dyeing process was finally done, and I was so relieved at this point. So after all of the dyeing was done, I could sew the bodice and the skirt together. And I ended up having a lot of issues with the bodice that I didn't expect. When I stood up straight, the tulle folds looked and laid really well, but as soon as I bent in any direction, it looked really terrible. They started like puckering. I had to go across each fold with a needle and thread and sew it down using a kind of slip stitch type of method so that you couldn't see the thread from the outside of the dress. And that took an extremely long time as well. And once I had gotten all of that done, it finally laid well, even when I bent over. And at some point during this, I also put boning in. I don't remember at what point, but I do remember that I actually had to cut off a large part of the boning. I ended up putting it down all the way to my hips, and it just buckled and bent in really weird ways and made me look lumpy and weird in places that I didn't look that way. And so what I ended up doing in the end is just cutting the boning to my waist and letting the rest kind of lay there, and that ended up turning out really well. So then once the bodice and the skirt were all done, I was finally able to attach the two together, and that was the moment I've been waiting for so long. I ended up hand sewing the tulle down next to where the eyelets were for the lace-up back, and it just looked really messy, and so I needed something to cover it up. So I tried to use ribbon. When I actually wore the dress, it kind of curved to the arch of my back, and I only tacked down the ribbon, so any part of it that wasn't tacked down started bubbling. That didn't look very good either. I later ended up changing that. I ended up braiding some tulle and sewing that down, and because of that, I was able to sew all the way down, and you weren't able to see any of the stitching because it was tulle. So that kind of fixed the problem with the ribbon, and also I think it overall just looked a lot better and a lot prettier. When I was sewing down all of those different layers of the folds on the bodice, I ended up stabbing my finger. I actually stabbed my finger multiple times during that process, and one of the times it actually drew blood and I didn't realize it. So under one of those folds and also on a piece of the belt, there's a little bit of blood, so you can literally say that my blood, sweat, and tears went into this dress. And so by this point, I was doing more finishing touch type of things. I was sewing on the back flap. I ended up adding 2 slanted flap pieces, and they created this kind of look so that most of the back was open, but the bottom was covered. I was adding the sleeves on as well. That part was really easy and simple. And then one of the last touches that didn't really make it to the wedding day very well was I added these butterflies onto it, but it wasn't really very wearable with those on, and they ended up falling off a lot. I had most of them on for the photo shoot that I did, the bridal shoot. There were actually like 3 of them that fell off during that shoot, and by the time I got to the wedding, I ended up cutting all of them off and hot gluing them to safety pins and then safety pinning those on. It worked a bit better. They still kind of fell off a bit. I had way less butterflies on the actual wedding day because of that. If I was to do it again, I would probably try to find butterflies that were made out of some sort of fabric, or I could actually sew the thread into the butterfly instead of having to loop around it, because these were made of foam for the center of them and then the wings were feathers, so I couldn't really anchor anything to it other than glue. But if I had had fabric ones, then they would maybe not have broken as much because they could kind of bend and flow with the fabric better, and I would be able to sew into the actual butterflies to really attach them to the dress without needing to use glue. And at this point, the dress was pretty much done. After this, I added some removable straps that didn't really work very well. I was working on that actually on the drive to the wedding, and then the day before the wedding as well, I was working on that just so that, you know, after we were done with the ceremony and the pictures and everything, I could still wear the dress and have it not fall down too often. So I think that's about all I have to say about sewing the dress. There's definitely a lot of little things I left out. I definitely had a lot of errors with this, but I also made more than just the dress for the wedding. That kind of flower crown that I wore, I made that myself and designed it myself. I got this blue gold stone in the shape of a moon. It took me forever to finally find one. But basically I took some wire and kind of made the shape of a crown with that. I took some thinner wire to attach the stone to it, and then I basically used hot glue to add flowers that I actually had in my bouquet, attached some butterflies as well, and some greenery and things like that. I also made and designed my bouquet myself. I ordered a bunch of silk flowers off of Amazon, just cut them up and put them together in a way that I liked. And honestly, I think it turned out super, super well. I love my bouquet. I still have it. And when I have like the space and a nice vase, I think it'd be really cool to display it. And something else I made, which was so easy in comparison to my dress, I actually made my husband's vest that he wore to the wedding as well. I luckily only had to dye it 3 colors. I actually made the pattern for his vest myself as well. I also made perfumes for us using grapeseed oil and essential oils. I actually did some research into perfumes and how to add the right amount of smells and the right variation. I read somewhere that that was kind of a thing to have a wedding perfume, and then every anniversary you put it on again, and then all of the memories of actually living through the wedding come back to you through the smell. And I definitely have experienced that with other smells in my life. Any scents that were actually very good were very, very expensive. And of course, there's always a chance that they get discontinued. So if I wanted to feel safe in having a perfume for my wedding, I would have had to buy several bottles of one very expensive perfume. It would have ended up being hundreds of dollars. And we were on a very, very tight budget, so I in no way had the money. I ended up making it myself. And it ended up smelling really, really great, and it lasted really well throughout the day, and I was super happy with that. And I made one for my husband as well. Now I can remake it anytime I want to. I made all my bridesmaids bouquets as well, and I made them perfumes for the wedding. Those are 2 things that I also made. I think that's about the extent of it, though. Nothing else very big was made by me, but there also wasn't really much more to the wedding other than those things, so I honestly made the majority of the wedding by hand. In a very limited amount of time with a very limited budget. So honestly, I am so proud of myself for making such amazing things, and so much of them with such limited resources, you know, moving between houses 3 weeks before the wedding, having to work in tiny rooms or in shared spaces to make those things. There were obviously a lot of things that were not perfect. There are a lot of things that I would have done differently had I known what I know now back then. But overall, I am just super happy about how the wedding turned out. I'm very proud of myself. The wedding was beautiful, the location was beautiful, so I think that's about it for now. I definitely was not perfect in this, but I hope that you guys can learn something from my mistakes and maybe gain some inspiration from things that I did do or didn't do. And I do actually have a video of my wedding, and I'll link that up here. That's about all I have for you, so stay tuned for future videos. I need to make an Iceland video. I have a lot of plans for the future. I'm trying to start a business making dresses because of how much I loved making this. Even though it was very difficult, I still loved it, and I have a lot of ideas for more dresses. So if you're interested in buying a dress, I don't have any for sale yet, and I'm going to start with more simple projects than this one. Obviously, it was a little bit more than I could handle. I am intending to start an Etsy shop eventually. I can't say for sure when right now because I have a lot going on in my life. But yeah, I appreciate anyone that watched this video, and I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. I will see you next time. My nose is so itchy. God damn. Why is my nose so itchy?
Your nose is killing you?
This happens every time I need to sit down to record something. Something is just annoying the shit out of me.
You just get nervous when you record and you have the fucking itchy nose when you do.
I hate it.